Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below. And I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like, because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to the issues. A hearty welcome to the Rabyd Nation. If you're looking for a channel to support, you watch my videos, you agree with where I'm going, you can always hit the join button and become a member. We're still working towards ad revenue and things like that, but I would appreciate anything you can have. And just a shout out to all the people that have done so already. Also, Super Chat is active too, so I just want to make that announcement. This is the first video that those things have been truly true, so I want to make sure I made that announcement. Today I want to continue on in my deconversion story, and there's certain things, like some of the things in my deconversion story are chronological, like going from one church to the other, going from Bible college to seminary, that sort of thing, has a chronological nature to it. But there are other things that are like overarching themes or ideas that I have to kind of talk about because they kind of run like a thread through the whole story. And one of those things is my love for comics and science fiction and fantasy books and literature and movies and series. And this actually did have an effect on my deconversion, in the sense that there are some concepts in comic books and science fiction and fantasy that kind of make you go, about, the Bible and the stories that it contains. Okay, so a little bit of backdrop. When I was a kid, I was on 10, 11 or so, I fell in love with Spider-Man. Now, don't ask me if I watched the movies. There are certain things that I don't like about MCU. There's other things I think they got really well. I think the Avengers series was really good and things like that. But a lot of the rest of it was Spider-Man. I've kind of lost interest, because Spider-Man was always, to me, the neighborhood hero. He was more of a low-powered, neighborhood type hero, and they've made him into something far bigger than he ever was originally, and I miss that. The big thing with Spider-Man was the snappy, sarcastic comments to me, which was always the fun part of learning new insults to people. But I began to think about heroes, and I got involved in comics, the Avengers, X-Men, a whole plethora of different comic book genres, and I would read them. I was one of those kids glued to the TV when any new Star Trek episode came on. When Star Wars came out, I was standing in line with my uncle in May in 1977, 78, wherever it was first released, to go see the movie. Became a big fan of that. I've already mentioned, when it came to my father, Babylon 5 kind of got me through my grief process, because there was always another episode. 2001 Space Odyssey, Spaceship 1999. All of these things were feeding into my imagination as a child and as a youth and later as a young adult. Now, what does that have to do with deconversion? Because some of these things ask some pretty hard questions of faith. I remember the episode of Babylon 5, for instance, where I think it's Sheridan is trying to explain religion to an ambassador from another alien race, and he wants to try to explain human religion. Eventually, he has to line up in the middle of Babylon 5, the space station. He has to line up like hundreds of people of all these different faiths that are human beings, and has the ambassador meet each one of them, because that's the only way he knows how to explain that human beings basically have different beliefs and different belief systems. Star Trek made some things, jabs at God too. I think it's Worf in the Next Gen makes a statement that the Klingons had killed all their gods, so they were more trouble than they were worth. Things like that. And I began to think about these things. I mean, is that arrogance, or is that just an understanding of what gods and goddesses and all this stuff is really about? And this stuff, in fantasy literature, I was a C.S. Lewis fan. Of course, I love the Chronicles of Narnia, a nice little story. Tolkien with his The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. The Hobbit still remains one of my favorite books of all time. And then, a friend of mine in high school introduced me to Robert E. Howard's Conan. And, I eventually had, there was an original 12-volume set of Conan. I think I had 10 of them. I absolutely went to the comic shop to get Conan the Barbarian comics every time they were released, new ones. And so I just had this fascination with heroes. And as I got older, of course, my taste got a little bit more sophisticated. And when I was in Bible college, a friend of mine introduced me to Robert Heinlein. And Robert Heinlein is probably the one that is probably the guy that kicked the living crap out of my religion and faith the most. But he did it in such a way that I loved him doing it. He's the guy that I get the main three objectives I try to do with every video. I try to make the video entertaining, I try to make it make you think, and I try to make money. And those are where his three objectives of writing. But one of the books, I remember my friend introduced me to him, and I read Space Cadet and then Starship Troopers and a whole bunch of others. I now have a collection of every book that he ever wrote, and I've read them several times. But the book that kicked my ass, the book that really challenged my thinking about religion, was this one, A Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. And the reason this kicked my butt is because Robert Heinlein is writing a fictional story, but the characters say things that make you go, And basically Mike, the man from Mars, basically the story is this kid was born on Mars. He's a human kid born to human parents on Mars that were a part of a space exploration. And then the space exploration went dead. Well, then when they sent another mission 20 years later, they found the kid still alive. He's 20 years old. The Martians, which, that back then when he wrote, there wasn't really any thought about who the Martians were, but the Martians have raised him, and so he has these almost godlike powers, and his name's Mike. Now, Mike comes back to Earth, and he truly is a stranger in a strange land because he doesn't think like anybody else. He thinks like a Martian in a human body, and Martians have a very different way of perceiving reality. Probably one of the most famous things that come out of that book is, do you grok? And if you don't know, then you don't know. But if you do know, you can let me know that in the comments. And Mike's biggest frustration with religion is, there's a scene where he has read all the religious books and he waves his hand at them and says, none of these contain the truth. They all have bits and pieces of the truth, but none of them have the truth. Okay? And, the list of religious books is quite extensive that Robert Heinlein gives. And so, there's this, I'm God, you're God, everyone is God statement that Mike makes, and other things like that. And what ends up happening is he begins to strip the veneer off the intellectual side of religion and say, no, I think it's Gerbil Henshaw who in the book, who's one of the characters, who says, it seems strange to me that the God of the universe wants us to all apprehend the one true God by faith. It seems a very inefficient way to run the universe. And I began to think about that, and I said, you know what, he's got a damn good point. It seems strange to me that God would put everything down to faith. Okay, and these were questions that began to come up in my mind. And a few questions continued to dog me. And in particular, I began to turn to the Bible itself, because I began at this time to start writing my own, fiction, fantasy stories, things like that. Nothing's ever been published. I've blogged many years, and I've put a lot of stuff on my blogs of various types, from the Gray Wayfarer to the All Things Rabyd. There's fiction on those blogs that I've written, and all of it kind of pertains to these ideas of mythology and characters and things like that. And my biggest issue became in my head. Okay, I know this is comics and fantasy, but I began to say, well, how is this any different? How is the Bible? How is this book over here? This thing, the Holy Bible. How is this different than this? Okay, how do I know that this isn't nothing more than an ancient version of fantasy sci-fi and hero stories? Okay, because when you really look at it, there's, comics are about the heroes. Um, there's this whole interplay. How do I know that this isn't just imagination? How do I know that this Bible thing isn't just gross fiction? Okay, it's just fictional stories. And as I began to dig into it, I began to realize that there might very well be some legendary, mythology to it. Because the real problem, for instance, with the character of Moses, there's definite proof that he couldn't have existed. Okay, the wanderings in the wilderness, the Exodus story, all of that stuff, there just isn't any evidence for it. There's no way to really date it accurately. And I began to realize, oh crap, maybe some of this is mythology. And then I began to look at Jesus himself, and I'm like, I can see now where somebody could write, where there could have been this rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth. And I have many theories about who Jesus was or whether he existed, and it's a debatable point to me. But I began to see how the character of Jesus grew as the story unfolds, as the different gospels are written. I mean, you start with Mark; he's pretty low key. He's got some superpowers, but it's like it's like the hero in a comic that disappears for a while, supposedly killed, and comes back with even better powers. And Matthew and Luke have Jesus having better powers, and then John just takes him completely to Superman status. And I began to realize, and it's at this time I began to look at the other Gospels that weren't canonized, and I began to put them in chronological order, and I began to notice something. The story keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more outlandish with each telling. And I also began to realize it was very difficult to prove that this wasn't just collecting hearsay stories, putting them in a book, and then the writers embellishing them. And then as people objected to Jesus being real, them adding other apologetic kind of elements to it. I mean, I think that's why the guard of the tomb is added in Matthew. I think other elements are added, like John adds, hey, we touched him, he wasn't a phantom. Things like that, where you get this growing, developing legend. And I began to realize that this is very much like mythology, where you'd have the stories of Hercules in the more earlier form. They're pretty tame, they're not big. But by the time you get done, Hercules is like doing these massive wonders and things like that. And I said, there's really not a lot of difference there, is there? And it did shatter my faith at first, because, maybe Jesus is the story they're all based on. But then I began to realize, like, the Old Testament is written after a bunch of other mythology, like the Gilgamesh epic. The Zoroastrianism definitely has some sort of effect on Old Testament stuff. Definitely the Jewish religion is based on it. When I got to Jesus, there's so many mythologies that the person writing the Jesus narrative could have came up with. I mean, there's definitely a political narrative. Recent archaeological discoveries have kind of said, that Herod was actually claiming to be the Messiah figure, and that is why Matthew, for instance, has to undercut him by putting the whole story in there about him slaughtering the innocents and all this other stuff, even though the timeline doesn't really fit what Jesus would have been. So it's like, I began to realize that there was definitely some creativity in all of this. There was definitely some legend building. There was definitely some fantasy, sci-fi, hero worship kind of thing. And it really changed my thinking about religion and my own, holy book, the old Holy Bible there. And I began to realize there wasn't a whole lot of difference between some of the comic books, some of the fantasy books that I read, some of the science fiction that I consumed, whether books or material. There wasn't a lot of difference between all of that and the Bible. And I began to think to myself, well, maybe these guys are just ancient sci-fi writers. I mean, the real problem is I think they pass it all off as real. But the thing is, it became no different over time. And now I kind of look at it as, yeah, it's mythology. A lot of it's mythology. Okay, no different than the Greek mythology or Norse mythology or whatever. There's an explanation to the universe, and it's all this fantasy thing. And as literature, as somebody who began to start to write some of this stuff, I began to look at the stories as literature and start to dissect them. And I realized there's literary devices here being used by the authors to make a point, and in such a way that it could undermine the historicity of the story. Okay, they're taking very big liberties with the story in order to make a point. And a lot of it is, like Matthew does a lot. I mean, he is very fast and loose with the Old Testament prophecies, and that's because he's doing a lot of post hoc rationalization in creating this messianic figure that he wants to present. Now, I don't think it's written by Matthew, but whoever the author of Matthew was, he's definitely trying to prove that Jesus was the Messiah to Jews. And I think what he's doing is he's like really grasping everywhere to make this proof and make this case. And it's very much like a defense attorney who knows the client is guilty, but they're trying to make stuff up in order to make him look better. And so as I began to look at all this stuff and began to make a correlation between this stuff, this stayed with me through my first church, my second church, my third church, all the way through my ministry. From the time I left Bible college, Stranger in a Strange Land, those questions about religion, bang, 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 bang. It's like over and over. It's like, what is this? What is this story? And as I began to do my own writing, I began to realize, you really could make some stuff up back in the day, and nobody would know it was made up if you try to pass it off as real. And that's the problem. Okay, that's the problem with the story. And so this is kind of, I guess the whole thing with comic characters and science fiction, all these are wonderful. I love these things to this day. Okay. But as far as my faith goes, I began to realize that the Bible may be no better than they are. There's it claims to be the Word of God once, but it's like, is it really? Or is that just a claim? A claim, nothing more. So that's kind of, I wanted to get that out there because as I go forward, you're going to hear me maybe reference some of these stuff where these questions are at hand, and people, oh, well, it's just science fiction and fantasy, it's not real. And I said, yeah, well, the problem is I could also make the statement about the Bible or the Quran or any other holy book that, all the Hindu literature is definitely there, and all, it's like these are all made up stories that have simply been preserved. And it's really hard to prove that they're not. Okay, it really is. So, I don't know. It began to challenge my thinking. So I guess Robert Heinlein was successful in his endeavors because he certainly entertained me and he did challenge my thinking. And even though he was dead by the time I hit Bible college, certainly his family and his foundation received some of my money. So objective achieved. But the thinking part, I was never able to completely shake the fact that this guy might be right about religion, that the observations made about religion in science fiction and fantasy, when you can make up a religion ad hoc for a fantasy novel, which I have done, and realize, yeah, they could have done the same thing with the Bible. They could have done it, just made it up. And unless you have some real good evidence, you have to prove that it's not. And so slowly but surely this kind of became the seed, the catalyst of other thinking and ways I went. And eventually I did, of course, lose my faith. But this was kind of an overarching thing from the time I was a kid all the way until the time I lost my faith, that I was constantly wrestling with these ideas that were presented in story. And the nature of story, the nature of literature, the nature of science fiction, fantasy, comic book, the heroism that we all love so much as human beings. And now I see the Jesus myth as mostly mythological. I think there's a lot of it that's crap, that's just straight up made up. Whether Jesus was a real person or not is a debatable point. I think there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that he was a historical figure. Mostly from a neutral source, but it's just one line. And, I think we need a little bit more than that to sit there and be a little bit more definitive. But I began to realize it all could be just a story that somebody made up. And that what religious writers back in the day were great fantasy and sci-fi writers. And, they got paid to do it, and people loved their stuff. So there you go. It's became popular. I know, well, me book is the proof of my God. Well, then every Spider-Man comic is proof of Spider-Man's existence, and on the list goes. Popularity and whether something says something doesn't prove that something exists in reality. So I began to realize that it was very, very possible that the whole thing was made up. It was very much possible that it was made up. Well, I'm going to stop it there. Next time I'll be getting into my second church in the Assemblies of God. I like to say that things got better for me, but you're going to find out that that's not the case. So, just stay tuned if you want to hear the rest. I don't really know how long this is going to go, other than I know I have a couple more churches to talk about and the moment of my deconversion to talk about and some of the aftermath that's happened since. So maybe 5, 6 more videos, so hang in there. Once I'm done with that, I'm not really sure what's going to be in this time slot. So, hang in there and we'll get the story finished. I'm doing this a lot for myself, not so much for the views on this series. This is more for me to encapsulate things, so as I'm writing my book about my deconversion story, I have kind of an outline to go with. So thank you for stopping by. Like, share, subscribe, consider hitting the join button and becoming a member of the Rabyd Nation, becoming a citizen, and just hang in there and be with me. I think it's been a great week. I picked up a lot of subscribers, about 20 of them this week. My latest video on Wednesday has been really cooking, so lots of theists showing up to tell me I'm wrong. It's always fun. I'm going to deal with some more issues on Sundays with the Rabyd Atheist, so make sure you tune in for that. So like, share, subscribe, do the things that you do. I appreciate every single one of you. Make sure you live your best life. You only get one go around, and so make sure it's a good one. And don't waste your time, your opportunities, your money, your talent on the trappings of religion. It's a waste of time. And you need to head forward with what you do best, and do it for you and the people that you love and care about. Thanks once again for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.